The snow had been falling since before dawn. By the time Victoria Cross reached the 52nd floor of the Meridian Financial Tower, Lake Michigan was invisible beneath a white haze, and the city below looked like a model built from salt. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass for exactly 4 seconds. She never stood anywhere longer than 4 seconds unless a camera was on her, and then walked to the head of the conference table. The quarterly reports were already open on every screen. Her executive assistant, a precise woman named Deborah, had arranged the slides in the order she preferred. Losses first, then recoveries, then projections. She knew better than to soften the opening. Victoria Cross did not like softening. She liked precision. She liked facts arranged in columns. She liked certainty. 12 faces looked up at her from around the table. Men and women in charcoal and navy, their coffee growing cold. Outside, the snow thickened. She clicked to the first slide, began to speak. The tremor started in her right hand. She noticed it the way you notice a car alarm in the distance, registered but not yet alarming. She gripped the laser pointer harder. The tremor did not stop. It traveled up her forearm. She kept talking. Revenue figures, margin compression, regulatory headwinds in the European market. Her voice was steady. Her hand was not. Then her left leg went strange. It was not pain. It was the absence of something, a sudden vacancy where sensation had been. She shifted her weight, and the floor seemed to tilt, though no one else flinched. She grabbed the edge of the table. The reports on the screen swam sideways. She opened her mouth to say something she would remember later, that she had intended to say the word, however. That she had a qualifier ready, a pivot toward optimism, and then the room dropped out from under her. She did not fall forward. She fell sideways, slowly, the way a very tall tree comes down in a forest when it has been cut cleanly through. Her shoulder caught the arm of a chair. Her laptop skidded off the table and struck the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Deborah was already on her phone. The head of security, a thick-necked former Marine named Vic Holloway, was through the door in under a minute. 2 board members knelt beside Victoria and said her name in the urgent, over-articulated way people speak to the very old or very young. Victoria Cross lay on the carpet of the 52nd floor and stared at the ceiling and could not feel her legs. Outside, the snow kept falling. The city kept going. Below, on Michigan Avenue, a delivery truck idled at a red light. The driver, a lean man with tired eyes named Elias Monroe, watched the flakes pile up on his windshield and thought about whether there was enough leftover pasta to feed 3 children for dinner. He did not know yet that his life was about to intersect with the woman on the floor above him. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The paramedics were good, calm, and quick, narrating procedures aloud the way they had been trained. Asking questions, Victoria answered in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness. They strapped her to the gurney with the same efficiency Victoria had always admired in systems that worked correctly. She was wheeled out through a service elevator so the lobby cameras would not catch the image. Her communications team was already drafting a statement. Her general counsel was already on a call. The snow swallowed the ambulance as it turned south on Michigan Avenue, lights spinning red through the white morning. The first neurologist's name was Dr. Patricia Halsey. She was 61 years old and had spent 30 years reading brains on film. She sat across from Victoria's MRI results with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to deliver bad news and worse uncertainty with equal composure. "The images are clean," she told her. "No stroke. No mass, no bleed." She had expected relief. She felt instead a cold unease she could not name. The second neurologist ordered a repeat MRI with contrast. The third added an EEG. The fourth sent her to a cardiologist who ran a stress echo and a Holter monitor. Clean. 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 A toxicologist screened her blood for 47 substances. Negative. An infectious disease specialist tested for a dozen rare autoimmune conditions. Negative. A rheumatologist, a pulmonologist, and a sleep specialist each contributed their notations to a file that grew thicker by the day. Each concluded the same thing in their own clinical vocabulary. Nothing wrong here. Look elsewhere. But Victoria Cross still could not feel her legs consistently. Some mornings the sensation was nearly normal, and she walked from her hospital bed to the window unaided, watching the snow fall in soft curtains over the city, her hands braced against the glass. Other mornings the floor might as well have been made of air. A physical therapist named Grantham came every afternoon with resistance bands and quiet encouragement. Some days Victoria cooperated. Most days she answered emails on her phone during the exercises, because stopping felt like losing. Reporters stationed themselves in the lobby of Meridian Tower. Her communications team released a statement. Miss Cross is receiving treatment for a temporary neurological condition and is expected to return to full capacity shortly. The phrase "expected to" did a great deal of work in that sentence. The eighth specialist was a renowned neuromuscular expert from Johns Hopkins, who had flown in specifically at the board's request. She spent 90 minutes with Victoria and left with her own set of inconclusive notes. By the time doctor number 15 came through the door, an autonomic specialist, a small and meticulous man named Dr. Farley, who asked questions about sweating patterns and pupil response, Victoria had stopped reading the incoming reports. She had, without fully acknowledging it to herself, begun to doubt that the answer would be found on a scan. The snow outside her window was 3 inches deeper than it had been when she arrived. A nurse named Beverly, who had worked the 7th floor for 19 years and had seen more than most attending physicians, paused in the hallway outside her room one evening and listened to the silence. No television, no phone calls, just a woman lying in a bright room while the city below carried on without her. She noted it in the margin of her own private notebook, not the official chart. Isolation. Controlled. Afraid. Then she went home and did not think about it again for several days. 23, 27, 30. By the time the 31st specialist, a functional medicine physician from a clinic on the North Shore, completed her assessment and added her notes to the towering file, 41 days had passed. 41 days of tests and consultations and polite, practiced uncertainty. Victoria Cross lay in her hospital bed on a Tuesday evening, watching snow fall past her window for the 41st consecutive day, and understood for the first time in her adult life that she did not know what was going to happen next. She had grown up in Rockford, Illinois, in a house where the heat sometimes failed in February, and dinner was whatever her mother could stretch from what the food bank had given that week. Her father had worked 2 jobs and come home smelling of motor oil and cigarettes. And when Victoria was 12, her father left and did not come back, and her mother sat at the kitchen table for 3 days and did not speak. And then, on the 4th day, she stood up and said, "We're fine." And that was the last time the subject was raised. She had internalized that lesson with the precision of a student who has no margin for error. She worked her way through University of Illinois on a combination of loans, scholarships, and a 40-hour-per-week job at a logistics company, where she eventually ran the night shift. She graduated without debt, which had seemed miraculous at the time and seemed less so later, when she understood that she had simply converted financial debt into biological debt, paying down one obligation by borrowing from her body, her sleep, her nervous system. By 30, she was running a regional investment firm. By 38, she had merged it into what would become Meridian Financial, one of the 6 largest institutional asset managers in the country. By 44, she had appeared on 3 magazine covers and given a commencement address at her alma mater in which she told the graduating class that the single most underrated professional virtue was the willingness to endure discomfort. She had believed it completely when she said it. She had also, by then, been a widow for 3 years. Her husband, Daniel, had died of an aggressive cancer that arrived without warning and moved fast. She had handled his illness the way she handled every crisis, by bringing in the best specialists, organizing the information, and continuing to work. She had held his hand at the end. She had cried, briefly, in a parking garage afterward, alone. Then she had gone back to the office. She had a daughter, Sophia, She had Daniel's eyes and Victoria's stubbornness, and a talent for drawing that neither of them had passed down. It had simply appeared, as some gifts do, from nowhere. She drew horses mostly, occasionally dragons. 8 years ago, on a Thursday in January, Victoria had been in a board meeting when her phone buzzed with a number she did not recognize. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She stepped into the hallway. The accident had happened on the Eisenhower Expressway. ICE, a jackknifed semi. Sophia had been in a car with her friend's family, coming back from a birthday party, and she had been wearing her seatbelt, and none of it had mattered. She was 9 years old. Victoria had organized her funeral with the same systematic focus she brought to a merger. She had made the calls, signed the documents, selected the readings, thanked the attendees. She had stood at the graveside in a black coat in January wind, and felt the cold as something external. A weather event, not a thing happening inside her. That evening she had gone back to the office. She had not, in the 8 years since, missed a single quarterly report. She had not taken a vacation longer than 4 days. She had not, to her own conscious knowledge, allowed herself to grieve in any sustained or witnessed way. She had run a company and attended charity galas and given interviews and signed papers and kept moving at the speed that, she had always believed, was the only acceptable speed for a person of her particular history. January had always been her worst month. She had never said so to anyone. The anniversary of Sophia's death had fallen on a Sunday, 4 days before she collapsed. She had worked through it. She always worked through it. Elias Monroe drove a delivery route that started at 4:30 in the morning and ended, on good days, around 1 in the afternoon. He covered a swath of the North Side and part of Evanston, 12 to 15 stops, packages ranging from small padded envelopes to awkward oversized boxes that required a dolly and a second trip. He was good at the job. He was good at most jobs he turned his attention to, though he had never particularly wanted to be a delivery driver. He had wanted to be a middle school science teacher, and for 2 years he had been, before his wife died. Renata had been 33 years old. The triplets, Noah, Elio, and Clara, had been 3 days old. Renata had known about the risk. They had spoken to doctors at length. She had made decisions with full information and absolute conviction, and Elias had supported those decisions because he trusted her, and because there was no version of himself that could have argued against her will. She had been, in his experience, almost always right about things that mattered. She had not been wrong, exactly. She had simply lost a gamble that the odds had said she would probably win. He had come home from the hospital with 3 infants and an instruction manual and a phone full of numbers from well-meaning relatives who lived in other cities. His mother-in-law, a sturdy woman named Gloria, had moved in for the first year. After that, it was Elias. Just Elias. And the 3 small people who looked nothing like him and nothing like each other, but somehow, in certain lighting, looked exactly like Renata. He had left teaching because the schedule would not accommodate 3 children and 1 income and no backup. He had picked up delivery work because it ended in the early afternoon, which meant school pickup was manageable. He had become a volunteer at Mercy General Hospital on Thursday and Saturday evenings because a grief counselor had told him, 2 years in, that connection was not a luxury, and he had believed her. The hospital work was simple. He brought things. Snacks from the volunteer cart, paperbacks from the donation shelf, and sometimes, if the floor nurses thought it was appropriate, he brought the children. Clara, Noah, and Elio were 7 years old. They had their mother's directness and their father's patience and a collective curiosity about the world that manifested differently in each of them. Noah collected facts the way other children collected trading cards. He would tell you, unprompted, that octopuses have 3 hearts, or that the word muscle comes from a Latin word for little mouse. Elio was quieter, observational, the kind of child who sat in a corner of a new place for 10 minutes before moving, reading the room. Clara asked questions. Good questions. The kind that made adults pause before answering. Elias had taught them, without intending to, that showing up for strangers was a reasonable way to spend an afternoon. On a Thursday in late January, he loaded them into his second-hand minivan after school, drove through a light snowfall to Mercy General, and signed in at the volunteer desk. The duty nurse, a cheerful woman named Sandra, who had given the children cookies once and been their favorite person ever since, waved them through. "We have someone on 7 who could use a visit," she said to Elias. "Private room." "She's been there almost 6 weeks. Not a lot of traffic." Elias looked at his children. Clara was already pulling her sketchbook from her backpack. "What does she like?" Noah asked Sandra, because Noah always wanted a briefing. "I genuinely don't know," Sandra said. "She's not a big talker." Elio considered this. "That's fine," he said. "We can be quiet." Room 714 was the largest private room on the floor. Someone, probably Victoria's assistant, Deborah, who managed her preferences with the quiet devotion of a person who took competence personally, had replaced the standard hospital-issue blanket with a charcoal cashmere throw. A laptop sat open on the tray table, its screen dim with inactivity. On the windowsill, a single arrangement of white flowers had passed their peak and were declining with a certain dignified droop. Victoria was sitting up when Elias knocked on the open door. She was wearing a dark sweater rather than a hospital gown, another Deborah intervention, and her reading glasses were pushed up on her forehead. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman of considerable resources who had been held in a place she had not chosen and was managing it very badly. "I'm told you might be open to a visit," Elias said from the doorway. He did not enter without invitation. He had learned, over years of hospital volunteering, that the threshold was important. Victoria looked at him. Then, behind him, at 3 children arranging themselves in the doorway with the particular self-consciousness of children who have been coached about hospital behavior. "Who are you?" Victoria asked, not rudely, flatly. "Elias Monroe. I'm a volunteer. These are my kids, Noah, Elio, and Clara." A pause. Outside the window, snow fell in slow spirals. "What do volunteers do, exactly?" Victoria asked. "Usually we just sit," Elias said. "Sometimes we bring things. Clara likes to draw." Clara, on cue, held up her sketchbook. Victoria looked at the sketchbook, then at Elias, then at the empty chair beside the window. She looked at all of this with the expression of a woman running a rapid calculation whose variables she did not fully understand. "Fine," she said. They filed in. Elio went immediately to the window and looked out at the snow with evident satisfaction, as if confirming a theory he had held. Noah located a chair and sat with his hands folded, waiting. Clara moved to the side table, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw without asking permission or explaining herself. Elias sat in the chair by the door, unhurried. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been before they arrived. The machines beeped at their intervals. The heat ticked in the vents. But the silence had changed texture. It was a shared silence now, the kind that does not need to be filled. Victoria watched Clara draw. She was sketching the window, the city beyond it, the falling snow. She pressed hard on the lines she was confident about and lighter on the ones she was still deciding. After perhaps 10 minutes, she turned the sketchbook and held it up without comment. She had drawn the room as seen from outside the window. A bright square in a dark tower, a figure in a bed, the snow falling all around. It was an unusual perspective for a 7-year-old. It placed the viewer outside, looking in. Victoria looked at the drawing for a long time. "That's good," she said, and she meant it without qualification, which was not a thing she said often. Clara nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already known. She flipped to a new page and began drawing again. This time she drew a sun, not a realistic sun, but a child's sun. Rays extended in even spokes and tore the page carefully along the perforation and placed it on the side table next to her water glass. Nobody explained the gesture. Nobody needed to. When they left an hour later, Victoria did not say goodbye in words. She raised her right hand slightly from the cashmere blanket. It was, for her, a significant thing. They came back on Saturday, and then the following Thursday, and then the Saturday after that. It became a pattern without any formal discussion, the way some things do by repetition, by mutual tolerance that gradually shaded into something warmer. Noah brought facts. He had learned, from Sandra at the volunteer desk, that Victoria ran a financial company, and he had spent an afternoon researching the history of banking in America with the focus of a graduate student, and he delivered his findings in organized segments during each visit. Victoria, who had a professional appreciation for organized information, found herself genuinely listening. Elio mostly watched. He had determined early that Victoria was a person who found sustained conversation effortful, and so he offered instead a kind of companionable observation sitting near the window, noting things aloud occasionally in the way of someone narrating a nature documentary for an audience of one. "There are 2 pigeons on that ledge," or "The snow is lighter than yesterday." Clara drew. Every visit, she left a drawing on the side table. A lighthouse, a dog in a snowstorm, a woman standing at a window. She never explained the drawings, and Victoria never asked. She simply kept them. Deborah, arriving one afternoon with a portfolio of documents to sign, noticed the small stack of drawings and said nothing, but moved them to a safer location on the shelf so they would not be knocked over. Elias sat. He was good at sitting. He had learned, in the particular school of sustained grief and solo parenting, that presence was not the same as activity, and that sometimes the most useful thing was simply to be an unhurried body in the room. He and Victoria talked occasionally. It was Elias who spoke first about Renata, one evening when the children had been collected by a hospital playroom program downstairs. He did not do it to establish intimacy or to model vulnerability. He did it because Victoria had asked, simply, "How long have you been doing this?" And the honest answer required context. 7 years, Elias said, since just after the kids were born. It was something to do that wasn't just surviving. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Your wife? Complications? 3 days postpartum?" Another silence. The heat ticked. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. It came out without the polished weight of a practiced condolence. It came out the way things do when they are true. The question came on a Thursday evening in mid-February, 3 weeks after the first visit. The snow had shifted from heavy to a fine, persistent drizzle of flakes, the kind that accumulates on every horizontal surface but barely registers as weather. Clara was sitting cross-legged on the end of Victoria's bed, a liberty she had taken gradually, advancing by increments, testing each increment for resistance, and finding none, drawing something that she had not yet shown to anyone. Victoria was watching her in the particular way she had developed over these weeks. Not studying, not analyzing, just watching. The way people watch fires. Clara looked up from her sketchbook. She looked at Victoria with the frank, unmediated attention that children apply to things they find genuinely interesting. "When was the last time you felt really happy?" she asked. "Like not worried about anything, just happy." The room stopped, not audibly. The machines continued their rhythms. Elio continued watching the street below. Noah looked up from the book of facts he had been reading to himself. But something in the room's quality changed. Victoria opened her mouth and closed it again. She looked at the window. The snow outside was very white against the evening dark. She looked at Clara, who was still watching her with complete patience, as if she had all the time available and had decided to spend it here. She thought of Sophia, not the way she usually thought of her as an absence to be moved around, a fact to be filed, but suddenly, specifically, in full color, Sophia, at age 7, running through Grant Park in winter, her scarf flying behind her, holding a red kite that kept trying to lift out of her hands. She had been laughing. The kind of laugh that came from the whole body, and Victoria had been standing 10 yards back, watching her, still in her coat and heels because she had come straight from the office. She had been happy. She had been completely, uncomplicated, happy, standing in the cold with her heels sinking slightly into the frozen ground, watching her daughter lose herself to a kite. She realized she had not thought about that moment in 8 years. She had sealed it away with everything else from before the accident, Behind a door she had closed and painted over and eventually forgotten was a door at all. Clara was still watching her. Her pencil was still in her hand. "A long time ago," Victoria said. Her voice was different, quieter, more careful, the way a person speaks when they are carrying something fragile. "What happened?" Clara asked. Elias looked up from across the room. He did not intervene. He had learned, over years of watching his daughter, that her questions deserved the room they opened. Victoria Cross, who had not cried in 8 years, who had built a $12 billion company on the foundation of never letting anyone see anything she could not afford to show, looked at a 7-year-old girl sitting cross-legged on the end of her bed with a sketchbook in her lap, and told her the truth. She did not tell her all of it that night. Some of it came out in pieces over the days that followed, fragments surfacing the way objects do after a flood recedes, revealing what the water had been carrying all along. But she told her about the kite, and about the red scarf, and about Grant Park in January. Clara listened the way she drew, with complete attention, without urgency, making small sounds occasionally that were not words but were clearly comprehension. When she finished, Clara looked down at her sketchbook and turned it around to show her. She had been drawing a kite, not because she had known, because she had been drawing what she imagined made her happy before she had told her what it was. The coincidence broke something open in Victoria. She did not cry then. She cried later that night, after Elias and the children had gone home. Alone in room 714 with the snow falling outside and the machines counting her heartbeat. She cried in the way people do when they have held it very long, not the clean, relieved weeping of films, but something that shook her whole body and left her exhausted in a way that was different from the exhaustion she had been carrying. Lighter somehow, as if the weight had changed composition. Beverly, the night nurse, heard her through the door. She did not knock. She updated her private notebook. Something shifted. The accident had been 8 years and 4 days ago, January 22nd, a Thursday. Victoria had woken that morning knowing what day it was she always knew and had done what she always did. Risen early, opened her laptop, and converted the anniversary into productivity. She had been in meetings for 11 straight hours. She had eaten a granola bar at her desk at 2 in the afternoon. She had driven home at 10:30 and poured a glass of scotch and sat in her apartment on the 63rd floor and looked at the city lights for 30 minutes, and the whole time she had felt nothing because she had not allowed herself to feel it, because feeling it meant stopping. And stopping meant she had never examined what stopping meant. She had simply refused to do it. Her body, it turned out, had been keeping its own account. The neuropsychiatrist who had been added to her team, a soft-spoken and thorough man named Dr. Ellison, who wore interesting shoes and asked questions, with the patience of someone doing archaeology, had begun asking different kinds of questions. After Beverly's update reached the appropriate people through the appropriate channels, not about symptoms, about history, about Daniel, about Sophia, about what a typical week looked like, and then what a typical Saturday looked like, and then what Victoria did when she felt overwhelmed. "I work," Victoria said, "and before you work?" A long pause. "I've never done anything before I work." Dr. Ellison wrote something in his notebook. Not frantically, just a note, the way a person marks something interesting in a margin. "Can you describe, as specifically as you can, how you felt in the 4 days before you collapsed?" Victoria described the anniversary, the 11 hours of meetings, the granola bar, the scotch, the city lights, the way the apartment had felt like a waiting room she had been sitting in for years without anyone calling her name. Dr. Ellison listened without interruption. After Victoria finished, the doctor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the same unhurried tone he used for everything, "Have you ever heard of functional neurological disorder?" Victoria had not. It's a condition where the brain and nervous system stop communicating correctly, not because of structural damage, but because of functional disruption. The hardware is fine. The software has encountered something it cannot process and has, in a sense, stalled. He paused. "In your case, I believe the disruption has been building for a very long time. Grief that was never processed doesn't disappear. It waits. And eventually, the body presents the bill. The diagnosis was functional neurological disorder. It was, in Dr. Ellison's careful explanation, both simpler and more complex than anything the 31 preceding specialists had been looking for. Simpler, because there was no structural damage. The MRIs had been correct. The scans had been correct. The blood work had been correct. There was nothing broken in the physical, mechanical sense. This was not a tumor or a clot or a toxin. More complex, because what was happening was a conversation between psychology and physiology that most medicine had only recently begun to take fully seriously. The nervous system, overwhelmed by sustained, unprocessed stress and unresolved grief, had begun generating real neurological symptoms, as real as any that might appear on a scan. The legs that did not work. The tremors. The episodes of dissociation that Victoria had described, with clinical detachment, as losing the room. All real. All generated from within. The body is not betraying you, Dr. Ellison said. It is communicating with you. Badly. Loudly. In a language you haven't been taught. But it is communicating. Victoria sat with this for a long time. She was, fundamentally, a woman who respected information when it arrived with adequate evidence. Dr. Ellison had adequate evidence. He laid it out in exactly the kind of organized sequence Victoria found credible. Timeline, causation, mechanism, prognosis. The prognosis was good. The prognosis required things from her that she had never previously been willing to give. Grief therapy would begin the following Monday. A psychologist named Dr. Wren, a woman who specialized in bereavement and had a waiting list 6 months long, which Victoria noted with the professional instinct of someone who understood market signals, had been brought in. Physical therapy would continue in parallel, retraining the neural pathways that had gone quiet. It would take time. Dr. Ellison was honest about that. There was no surgery for this, no medication that would close the loop. There was only the sustained work of allowing what had not been allowed. The children helped. Beverly told Dr. Ellison when he asked about the turning point. She had been observing long enough to report accurately. She changed after they started coming. Something in her became less defended. Dr. Ellison noted this too. There was, he had observed in 20 years of practice, no substitute for what happened when a genuinely open person sat with a genuinely closed one. The openness was contagious in a way that clinical detachment was not. Children, in his experience, were particularly potent carriers because they had not yet learned that vulnerability was a liability. On the first Monday of grief therapy, Victoria sat in a room with Dr. Wren and was asked to talk about Sophia. She talked for 2 hours. She had expected it to be like pulling something that had calcified. Instead, once she began, it was more like turning on a faucet that had been sealed for a very long time. Pressure was there, had always been there. And the release was not the painful thing. The sealing had been. She told Dr. Wren about the kite. She told her about Daniel. She told her about the parking garage, the 3 minutes of crying, the return to the office. She told her about January 22nd, repeated 8 times, worked through in meetings. She cried during the session. Not theatrically. Steadily, the way winter rain falls when there is no drama left in the weather. Outside her window, the snow had thinned. On Tuesday, Grantham arrived for physical therapy, and Victoria met him at the door, standing unassisted, weight distributed evenly. "Let's get started," Victoria said. Grantham smiled and did not say anything sentimental. He simply held the door. Recovery was not a line. It was a terrain with rises and setbacks, with mornings that felt like emergence and afternoons that felt like retreat. Victoria had always believed, in the abstract, that hard things required sustained effort. It was different to live that belief in a context where effort was internal and invisible, and could not be tracked on a dashboard. On the first day, she walked the full length of the 7th-floor hallway without support. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in a way that was ordinary, human, without the edge of crisis. It was, she would tell Dr. Wren later, the most ordinary she had felt in years. Elias and the children came on Thursday. Clara brought a new drawing, a woman walking down a long corridor, light coming through windows on one side. She placed it on the shelf with the others. The collection had grown to 17 drawings. Victoria had not asked anyone to organize them or frame them or handle them in any particular way. She had simply let them accumulate. On this Thursday, she asked Elias to walk with her. They went down the hallway and back. It was not a long walk. Victoria moved carefully, paying attention to each step with the concentration of someone relearning a language they had once spoken without thinking. Elias walked beside her at the same pace, neither leading nor lagging, his hands in his pockets. They talked about ordinary things. Elias mentioned that Noah had won a regional geography bowl at school. Victoria said that geography had been the only class in which she had ever received a failing grade. Elias laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unperformed, and the sound of it in the antiseptic corridor was unexpectedly pleasant. "How long have you been doing this volunteering?" Victoria asked. 7 years. "Started when the kids were about 6 months. What made you decide to include them?" Elias thought about it as they reached the end of the hall and turned. "I think I didn't want them to learn that other people's problems are something to look away from. That seems like the wrong thing to grow up believing." Victoria processed this for several steps. "Your kids ask good questions," she said finally. "Clara, especially. She's always been like that. I used to worry it was rude." In her 3rd week of grief therapy, Victoria brought a photograph to the session. It was the only photograph of Sophia she had not packed away after the accident. It had lived in the back of her desk drawer for 8 years, face down. She had not looked at it in all that time, not because it was there, but because looking had not been possible. It was a photograph from Grant Park. January. She was holding the red kite. Her scarf was flying sideways. She showed it to Dr. Wren without comment. She looked at it for a moment. "She looks exactly as you described her." "She was?" Victoria said. "She really was." She asked Deborah, the following week, to arrange for a permanent position on the hospital's advisory board for community programs. She had ideas about funding for volunteer programs, specifically not just equipment and staff, but the kind of sustained support that kept people like Elias Monroe in hallways on Thursday evenings, walking beside people who were learning how to walk again. Deborah wrote it down without expression, which was her expression for approval. The February snow began to ease in the last week of the month. The temperatures crept above freezing for the first time since early January. Water ran in thin streams along the gutters. On a Sunday afternoon, pale winter light found its way into room 714 at an angle that had not been possible when the sky was uniformly gray. Victoria sat in the chair by the window and let it land on her hands. She stayed that way for a long time, not thinking about anything scheduled, not calculating. Just sitting in a room, in the light, alive. She returned to Meridian Financial on a Monday in early March. Not to the 52nd floor, not immediately. She took a meeting first in a smaller conference room on the 14th, the room used for internal team reviews, which had carpet instead of hardwood and a view of the parking structure rather than the lake. Her senior leadership team sat around the table with the careful attentiveness of people who had been managing in a vacuum for 2 months and were braced for correction. She looked around at them for a moment. "I want to talk about how we work," she said. "Before we talk about numbers." There was a pause. It was not the pause of resistance. It was the pause of people recalibrating their expectations rapidly. What followed was not a reinvention of the company. Victoria was too precise for reinvention, too aware of what worked and what the structure had been built to achieve. But it was a renegotiation of certain assumptions that had calcified over years into the appearance of inevitability. She had been running the company on the premise that endurance was the primary professional virtue, that the people who stayed longest and worked hardest were by definition the most committed, and that commitment was the same as value. She had believed this because it had been true for her in the circumstances that had shaped her, and she had never examined whether those circumstances were universal. They were not, she now understood, universal. Some of what changed was structural. Flexible scheduling that had been promised and never implemented, a mental health support program that had existed on paper but required a supervisor's approval to use, which meant it had not been used, a policy review that had been scheduled annually and deferred annually for 4 years running. Some of what changed was harder to codify. She learned, slowly, to ask different questions in meetings. Not only, what are the numbers, but what are we missing, and, occasionally, how is this affecting people? These were not the questions she had asked before. They required her to tolerate answers that arrived without columns. She asked Elias Monroe to join the advisory committee of the Meridian Foundation, the company's philanthropic arm, which had been focused primarily on financial literacy programs in underserved communities. Elias was not, by any professional definition, a peer of the other committee members, former officials, university department heads, executive directors of established nonprofits. He was, however, a person who showed up. Who knew what showing up meant when there was no audience? Who had, over 7 years of Thursday and Saturday evenings, accumulated a form of expertise that was not on any resume but was in everything he did. Elias said yes after thinking about it for a week. He brought Noah and Elio and Clara to the Foundation's first meeting of the new year, because it was a Saturday, and he had not arranged other childcare, and because he was, at this point, finished apologizing for his children's presence in rooms. Clara drew the meeting room. She drew the long table and the people around it, and, in the corner of the drawing, a window with snow beginning to melt outside it. She gave the drawing to Victoria at the end. She put it with the others. They had been framed by now 17 drawings by Clara Monroe, hung in a clean line on the wall of her home office, where she could see them from her desk. She had moved Sophia's photograph from the back of the drawer to the top of the desk. Face up, on a Saturday in late March, she drove alone to Grant Park. She brought nothing. She parked and walked to the section of the park where she remembered the kite flying, which took longer than she expected because memory is unreliable about geography. She found a spot that felt approximately right, a wide-open section of lawn, still brown from winter, with the lake visible to the east and the city visible to the west. She stood there for a while. She did not have a kite. She had not thought to bring one. That was fine. She was learning, slowly, that the monument mattered less than the standing, that being in a place and acknowledging what had happened there was itself the thing. She thought about Sophia, about Daniel, about the parking garage, about January 22nd, repeated 8 times behind a closed door. She thought about Clara's question. When was the last time you felt truly happy? She was beginning to have an answer that was not 8 years old. The wind off the lake was sharp and cold, and entirely real. She stood in it for a long time. Then she put her hands in her pockets and walked back to her car. The drive back through Chicago was ordinary in the way she was learning to find valuable. Traffic lights, a pedestrian with a dog, a coffee shop with a line of people out the door in the thin March sun, the kind of morning that belonged to everyone, the kind she had been passing through, unseeing, for years. She had been right about one thing, all those years ago, in the commencement address. Endurance was a professional virtue. She had simply been wrong about what it meant to endure. She had confused continuity with survival. She had confused staying in motion with staying alive. A woman who had spent 40 years building things had required, in the end, a question from a 7-year-old to understand what building was for. The light changed. She drove on. In a delivery van 3 miles north, Elias Monroe was finishing the last stop on his route. He pulled into the parking lot, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. Through the windshield, the city moved in its ordinary ways. People on sidewalks, pigeons on ledges. The lake impossibly bright in the distance. He had 3 children who asked good questions. He had a meeting on Saturday. He had, all told, enough.